Hello everyone, welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Hampar. Today I will be talking about another fantasy essay. Now this is a series I started a couple months ago, talking about some essays by Tolkien, Le Guin, Moorcock, Butler, Gene Wolfe, I think, oh, I went by Fritz Leiber, so I think those are all of them. But today I want to talk about one that's a little different, as it's not really written so much as an essay. I also took no notes for this, so this will be a little different. So hopefully I can stay focused and actually get some meaningful words out into this video. So this one is actually the last chapter of a book. It's really short, actually. It's 7 pages. That's the chapter is 7 pages. I would recommend reading the book, of course, but this is Flame and Crimson: A History of Sword and Sorcery by Brian Murphy. Now the last chapter itself is called Why Sword and Sorcery. It starts with this nice epigraph here that says, "The time has come for sorcery and swords," which is from Leiber's The Lords of Quarrel, which is in Swords Against Wizardry, the 4th book in the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser saga. So he mentions a lot of stuff here, actually. He mentions, he has kind of an underlying point of what he's trying to say, what sword and sorcery is good for, and then maybe what else it could be good for. So he starts off talking about the main thing, I guess, right? He says, Edgar Rice Burroughs, forefather of the genre and creator of Tarzan and John Carter of Mars, summed up in a 1930 essay for Reader's Digest, "Entertainment is fiction's purpose." And that's the quote, "Entertainment is fiction's purpose. Art requires no further purpose than being in the colorful, bold form of storytelling known as sword and sorcery very much is." And so he's basically just talking about that, at its core, sword and sorcery is entertainment, right? And it exists. So, he also says, it is Conan in The Tower of the Elephant matching his speed and sinew against a giant, implacable spider. It is the bard Capinvara and the northern hero Jaime enjoying the attentions of women whom they have fought to rescue, including the wife of a powerful magnate whose ardent embrace is as hazardous as any sword duel. So it goes on and it talks about basically entertainment, right? If fiction, what is fiction for? And that is to entertain. Okay, we've kind of talked about that before. That also goes along with some other things, which he mentions later, I believe. He talks about the entertainments also for things like escapism, but he connects sword and sorcery specifically to a certain type of escapism. But he says, at its core, it's entertainment, right? He says, you can go into and read Bazaar the Bazaar, which is by Fritz Leiber, or The Tale of Satampra Zeros, which is by Clark Ashton Smith, and you, in short order, he says, visiting strange worlds and experiencing vicarious adventure without wading through tedious info dumps of culture and politics. So basically, you're going to be entertained. You're going to be entertained quickly, at least in sword and sorcery, right? You're not going to get a bunch of stuff that high fantasy is known for, at least these days. It's actually funny. I got a copy of The Birthgrave the other day, which is about 400 pages. It came out in '75, I believe, and in 2 parts in that book, not the actual story parts, it says this novel's huge, basically, which I think is hilarious because that would be considered rather short by most standards today. Anyways, that's kind of off topic. So he then says it is the fantasy equivalent of Tinder, but largely without the guilt. I have no experience with Tinder, so yeah, he's basically saying sword and sorcery it entertains, and that should be enough, essentially, right? So he could end the chapter there, but he's also saying that it's more, and it's been dismissed because some people just say that that it does exist, basically, and that it only entertains, which he's saying isn't the case. They call it crude art, right, essentially. And so he's saying it's misunderstood, and the aesthetic, quote, the aesthetic it offers to the wider fantasy genre largely is unprobed. So then he goes in why sword and sorcery. So he says, on July 28th, 1914, millions of young men inflamed with national pride responded to the call of duty and marched onto the battlefields of France. Theirs was no romantic ride into battle on horseback rose-wreathed sabers aloft, but a methodical suicidal advance across muddy fields and then machine gun fire, places like the Somme and Below Wood. In 4 years of warfare, more than 9 million combatants were killed. On October 29, 1929, a stock market crash known as Black Tuesday ushered in the Great Depression, sending hundreds of thousands of young men to the unemployment line. In the United Kingdom, unemployment reached as high as 20%. In the U.S., it peaked at 25%. Which, if you hadn't noticed, this deals precisely when Sword and Sorcery was created, as that interwar period. And then it gets a renaissance in the 60s, if you weren't aware. Like, Michael Moorcock is the big one to come out of that. He says in 1965, American men as young as 18 were drafted to fight a war many considered unjust and thrust into jungle combat in Vietnam against an enemy that often wore no uniforms. There was no clear objective, no exit strategy. More than 58,000 were killed in action. And so he's basically saying, this is a lot of stuff, that you're not comfortable with, basically, right? It's entertainment, in a sense, in turbulent years. So it says, basically, mankind, even here, says, mankind has been pushed from its former place at the center of the universe. It says a bunch of where questions. Where there were once battles, or they're not questions, sorry, they're statements. It's where there were once battles of sword versus sword with a chance of quarter and ransom. Today, soldiers at computers dispatch unmanned drones to bomb distant targets. Where once we believed we had free will, behavioral psychology and neuroscience has brought our motivations into doubt. Where once most believed in a benevolent, all-knowing God who offered the consolation of an afterlife, that certainty is gone. Where there was once certainty, we are now assailed with doubt and worse. He gives a quote. I can't remember who this is, actually. Let's see. Oh, Max Weber is a German, or probably Weber, German philosopher. Says, the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. Precisely the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life, either into the transcendental realm of mystic life or into the brotherliness of direct and personal human relations. It is not accidental that our greatest art is intimate and not monumental. And so he basically is talking about, he even says, right, that they were disenchanted, right? Especially these precursors to Sword and Sorcery. And then, he mentions Lovecraft specifically and Howard and their perceived misfortune of being born when they were. And he says later on, few fates are more enervating than an inability to change one's circumstances, and being a cog in an uncaring mechanical universe. Sword and Sorcery rages against this machine, and it offers the modern reader an alternative, posing the question, which is the superior? The old barbaric ways in which life was nasty, brutish, and short, but men and women were at least masters of their own fate, operating with a heightened awareness, born of daily struggles for survival, or the modern industrialized state in which we accept security and civility and predictability in exchange for hyper-specialized, disconnected jobs, purposelessness, and widespread anxiety and depression. He makes sure to separate it from the romanticism of the 19th century that got them into a lot of those problems anyways. But the point here, right, it says, in Sword and Sorcery, the warrior with a sharp sword and an iron will is exalted. It is the ultimate expression of anthropocentrism and the ultimate rejection of pessimism, cynicism, and powerlessness. Conan, a wild-haired barbarian from the Horde, rises from savage to thief to mercenary to war chief and eventually to king of Aquilonia. He is a paragon of human achievement, not born into power or prestige, but a man who carves a bloody path to the top with his sword arm, cunning, and naked will. Sword and Sorcery fills an aesthetic void left by high fantasy. It brings to center stage the outsider, the hero on the periphery. Instead of the king-in-waiting Aragorn or the conservative lover of hearth and home Bilbo, Sword and Sorcery offers the likes of Grey Mouser and Elric of Melniboné, lusty nonconformists, disaffected political anarchists, wanderers, and wayfarers. Its heroes offer a voice for the disaffected. They enjoy life and its basic pleasures. They reject positions of authority because they know the dreadful ethical and spiritual compromises these positions often require. Much sword and sorcery is pure entertainment and entertainment only, but at its best it offers thoughtful commentary on the human condition. Sword and sorcery does not recreate ancient history or offer up post-Roman Dark Age barbarism as a human ideal. This is a mistaken analysis that has led some to label the subgenre as misguided and dangerous romanticism, or equate its frequent use of bronze-skinned and blood-headed barbarian heroes to Hitlerian fascism. The barbaric template offered by sword and sorcery fiction is a myth. In almost all instances, it ignores historical barbarism's gross inequalities and abhorrent traditions, but historical fidelity is not its intent. Its heroes are a facet of our humanity, a reminder of the potency of individual sovereignty and human agency. And then he quotes Tolkien, right, in his On Fairy Stories, which we've already gone over, and the idea of escapism. And he says, sword and sorcery breaks the spell of despondency cast by an unsatisfying reality and the suffocation of economic and social forms of control. Readers returning from its pages look upon the world with a new perspective and a restored vision. Howard felt an urge for renewal after his exchanges with Lovecraft. Howard needed re-enchantment, even if that meant creating worlds in mortal peril populated with wicked sorcerers and foul monsters and great empires that rise from chaos and savagery only to fall to the ground to the dust of eternity. As with Howard, Fritz Leiber began writing his stories in the throes of the Great Depression, when the excesses and promises of the Roaring Twenties came to a crashing end for millions. His city of Lankhmar, though crime-ridden and dangerous, offers wealth and opportunity for the brave. The unshakable friendship of his two heroes are a reminder that salvation lies in people, not institutions. And he talks about Moorcock a little bit. I don't want to read. I've read so much from this, but it's really good. I am skipping a lot, so you should get the book, right? I mean, because I don't think you can just read this chapter online anywhere. So you should get Flame and Crimson. He says, it is no coincidence that sword and sorcery is born in the turbulent years between two world wars, then returned to prominence as civilization again appeared on the brink of ruin following the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. Let's see. The literature, I think this is a quote. This is Le Guin, actually. It says, the literature of imagination, even when tragic, is reassuring, not necessarily in the sense of offering nostalgic comfort, but because it offers a world large enough to contain alternatives and therefore offers hope. And he goes on to say, the best fantasy allows us to both enjoy and view, to read for sheer enjoyment and pleasure's sake, while consciously or subconsciously providing a mechanism for examining our own beliefs and prejudices and reframing our social, cultural, and political structures, which reminds me a lot of Moorcock's Epic Pooh, actually, where he's, I think he would agree that he wants more than just entertainment, right? The long look back from our own 21st century experience to the worlds of sword and sorcery seen through the lens of ocean-washed Atlantis, the passage of millennia, brings the world we've left behind into sharper view. When we join authors like Howard, Leiber, Moorcock, and Wagner in their best tales of escape, we take the journey with our eyes and our minds open and return with a clearer appreciation of what is right and good in the world, and what is wrong or has been distorted or lost. And of course, above all else, we return entertained. And those are the last words of the whole book, actually. And so I don't have a lot to say about that. I feel like outside of, I think Murphy nailed it. I think that's one thing, actually. It's an interesting view, especially when you connect things. World War I itself kind of created a lot of modern fantasy, or at least the response to that, and in some ways, here's my one thing that I think Murphy agrees with, honestly, but when you read something like Tolkien, it's not cynical, and it's very different from Sword and Sorcery, and I don't think Sword and Sorcery in a lot of cases is that cynical either, maybe towards certain things, especially if you read like Moorcock, but it's like, it's very more, it is in some ways disenchanted, but like, I think that's one thing that separates Sword and Sorcery from something like Grimdark, which is cynical for cynical's sake. It's the people who came out of World War I and didn't actually come out of it at all, if that makes sense, where people had like Tolkien who survived and made something good out of it, or people who lived, around that time, like Robert E. Howard, who, are making some good of it, though, of course, Robert E. Howard died. He committed suicide. But it's just like, it's interesting to me, right? Because I don't read Conan and I think, oh, this is hugely cynical and, like, I don't want to read this. But it's a lot of times why I steer away from books that are labeled grimdark, which I don't think is a great label anyways, and I have read grimdark and enjoyed, it plenty. But it's just like, when you're just going out to be so cynical, I don't know, maybe that's not, that is why Sword and Sorcery, right? It's like, why? Because you're the master, right? The humanity is the master, your own sword arm, right, is the sense, in a sense, right? It's like you can go and create this, become the master of your own fate again, right? Essentially. Take the good, leave the bad behind. But anyways, I'm kind of rambling at this point. I didn't write anything down, hence my thoughts probably not making a lot of sense. So hopefully that made some sense to someone. Yeah, feel free to disagree with me or with Murphy at all. But I, again, highly recommend Flame and Crimson. It's a really easy read. It's not super long. As far as history books go, I mean, considering most of you, almost all of you are watching are fans of fantasy, go and read this. I think you will appreciate the genre more, especially Sword and Sorcery, obviously. So anyways, this one, Liam Lyceum. I will catch you next time.